Chapter 5. The First Month. 3 days after my arrival in prison, I was ordered to go out to work. That first day of work is very distinct in my memory, though nothing very unusual happened to me in the course of it, except in so far as my position was in itself unusual. But it was still one of my first impressions, and I still looked eagerly at everything. I had spent those 3 days in the greatest depression. "This is the end of my wanderings. I am in prison," I was continually repeating to myself. "This is to be my haven for many long years, my niche which I enter with such a mistrustful, such a painful sensation. And who knows? Maybe when I come to leave it many years hence I may regret it," I added, not without an element of that malignant pleasure which at times is almost a craving to tear open one's wound on purpose, as though one desired to revel in one's pain, as though the consciousness of one's misery was an actual enjoyment. The idea of ever regretting this whole struck me with horror. I felt even then how monstrously a man may get used to things. But that was all in the future, and meantime everything about me was hostile and terrible, for though not everything was really so, it seemed so to me. The savage curiosity with which my new comrades, the convicts, stared at me, the extra surliness of their behavior towards the new member of their community, who had been a gentleman, a surliness which sometimes reached the point of active hatred. All this so tortured me that I was eager to begin work, so as to find out and test all my sufferings as soon as possible, to begin living like all the rest, so as to get into the same rut with all the others without delay. Of course, there was a great deal I did not notice then. I had no suspicion of things that were going on in front of me. I did not divine the presence of consolation in the midst of all that was hostile. Yet the few kind and friendly faces I had come across in the course of those 3 days helped to give me courage. The kindest and friendliest of all was Akim Akimych, and among the faces of other convicts that were sullen and full of hatred, I could not help noticing some kind and good-natured ones. "There are bad people everywhere, and good ones among the bad," I hastened to console myself by reflecting. "And who knows? These people are perhaps by no means so much worse than the remainder who have remained outside the prison." Even as I thought this, I shook my head at the idea. And yet, my God, if I had only known at the time how true that thought was! Here, for instance, was a man whom I only came to understand fully in the course of many, many years, and yet he was with me and continually near me almost all the time I was in prison. This was the convict Sushilov. As soon as I begin to speak of prisoners being no worse than other men, I involuntarily recall him. He used to wait on me. I had another attendant, too. From the very beginning, Akim Akimych recommended me one of the convicts called Osip, telling me that for 30 kopecks a month he would cook my food for me every day if I so disliked the prison fare and had the money to get food for myself. Osip was one of the 4 cooks elected by the convicts for our 2 kitchens. They were, however, quite free to accept or refuse the appointment and could throw it up at any moment. The cooks did not go out to work, and their duties were confined to baking bread and preparing soup. They were not called povars, that is, male cooks, but stryapki, that is, female cooks, not as a sign of contempt for them, for sensible and, as far as might be, honest convicts were chosen for the kitchen, but just as an amiable pleasantry which our cooks did not resent in the slightest. Osip was, as a rule, elected, and for several years in succession he was almost always cook, and only threw up the job occasionally for a time, when he was overcome with violent melancholy and a craving for smuggling in vodka. He was a man of rare honesty and gentleness, though he was in prison for smuggling. He was the tall, sturdy smuggler I have mentioned already. He was afraid of everything, especially of a flogging, was friendly to everyone, very meek and mild. He never quarreled, yet he had such a passion for smuggling that he could not resist bringing in vodka in spite of his cowardice. Like the other cooks, he carried on a trade in vodka, though of course not on the same scale as Gazin, for instance, because he had not the courage to risk much. I always got on capitally with Osip. As for providing one's food, the cost was trifling. I am not far wrong if I say that I hardly spent more than a ruble a month on my board, always excluding bread, which was part of the prison fare, and occasionally soup, which I took if I were very hungry in spite of the disgust it inspired, though that too passed off almost completely in time. Usually I bought a pound of beef a day, and in winter a pound cost a halfpenny. One of the old veterans, of whom there was one in each room to keep order, used to go to the market to buy beef. These veterans voluntarily undertook to go to market every day to buy things for the prisoners, and charged the merest trifle, next to nothing for doing so. They did this for the sake of their own peace and comfort, for they could hardly have existed in the prison if they had refused. In this way they brought in tobacco, tea in bricks, beef, fancy bread, and so on. Everything, in fact, but vodka. They were not asked to bring in vodka, though they were sometimes regaled with it. For years together Osip roasted me a piece of beef, always the same cut. But how it was roasted is another question, and indeed is not what mattered. It is a remarkable fact that for several years I hardly exchanged 2 words with Osip. Several times I tried to talk to him, but he was incapable of keeping up a conversation. He would smile or answer yes or no, and that was all. It was strange to see this Hercules who was like a child of 7. Another convict who helped me was Sushilov. I did not ask for his services nor seek them. He found me out and placed himself at my disposal of his own accord. I don't remember when or how it happened. He did my washing. There was a large hole for emptying the water at the back of the prison, made on purpose. The washing troughs stood above this hole, and the convicts' clothes were washed there. Sushilov invented 1,000 different little duties to please me. He got my tea ready, ran all sorts of errands, took my jacket to be mended, greased my boots 4 times a month. All this he did eagerly, fussily, as though no one knew what duties he was overwhelmed with. In fact, he completely threw in his lot with mine, and took all my business on himself. He would never say, for instance, "You have so many shirts, your jacket is torn," and so on, but always, "We have so many shirts now, our jacket is torn." He watched me to forestall every want, and seemed to make it the chief object of his life. He had no trade, and I think he earned nothing except from me. I paid him what I could, that is in halfpence, and he was always meekly satisfied. He could not help serving someone, and pitched upon me, I fancy, as being more considerate than others and more honest in paying. He was one of those men who could never grow rich and get on, and who undertook to act as sentry for card-players, standing all night in the freezing cold passage, listening to every sound in the yard, on the alert for the major. They charged 5 farthings for spending almost the whole night in this way, while if they blundered they lost everything and had to pay for it with a beating. I have mentioned them already. It is the leading characteristic of such men to efface their personality always, everywhere, and before almost everyone, and to play not even a secondary but a tertiary part in everything done in common. All this is innate in them. Sushilov was a very pitiful fellow, utterly spiritless and humbled, hopelessly downtrodden, though no one used to ill-treat him, but he was downtrodden by nature. I always, for some reason, felt sorry for him. I could not look at him without feeling so, but why I was sorry for him I could not have said myself. I could not talk to him either. He, too, was no good at conversation, and it was evidently a great labor to him. He only recovered his spirits when I ended the conversation by giving him something to do, asking him to go somewhere or to run some errand. I was convinced at last that I was bestowing a pleasure upon him by doing so. He was neither tall nor short, neither good-looking nor ugly, neither stupid nor clever, somewhat pock-marked and rather light-haired. One could never say anything quite definite about him. Only one other point. He belonged, I believe, as far as I could guess, to the same section as Sirotkin, and belonged to it simply through his submissiveness and spiritlessness. The convicts sometimes jeered at him, chiefly because he had exchanged on the way to Siberia, and had exchanged for the sake of a red shirt and a rouble. It was because of the smallness of the price for which he had sold himself that the convicts jeered at him. To exchange meant to change names and consequently sentences with someone else. Strange as it seems, this was actually done, and in my day the practice flourished among convicts on the road to Siberia, was consecrated by tradition, and defined by certain formalities. At first I could not believe it, but I was convinced at last by seeing it with my own eyes. This is how it is done. A party of convicts is being taken to Siberia. There are some of all sorts, going to penal servitude, to penal factories, or to a settlement. They travel together. Somewhere on the road, in the province of Perm, for instance, some convict wants to exchange with another. Some Mikhailov, for instance, a convict sentenced for murder or some other serious crime, feels the prospect of many years' penal servitude unattractive. Let us suppose he is a crafty fellow who has knocked about and knows what he is doing. So he tries to find someone of the same party who is rather simple, rather downtrodden and submissive, and whose sentence is comparatively light, exiled to a settlement or to a few years in a penal factory, or even to penal servitude, but for a short period. At last he finds a Sushilov. Sushilov is a serf who is simply being sent out to a settlement. He has marched 1,500 miles without a farthing in his pocket, for Sushilov, of course, never could have a farthing. Exhausted, weary, tasting nothing but the prison food, without even a chance morsel of anything good, wearing the prison clothes, and waiting upon everyone for a pitiful copper. Mikhailov accosts Sushilov, gets to know him, even makes friends with him, and at last, at some étape, gives him vodka. Finally, he suggests to him, would not he like to exchange? He says his name is Mikhailov, and tells him this and that, says he is going to prison. That is, not to prison, but to a special division. Though it is prison, it is special, therefore rather better. Lots of people, even in the government in Petersburg, for instance, never heard of the special division all the time it existed. It was a special, peculiar little class in one of the remote parts of Siberia, and there were so few in it, in my time not more than 70, that it was not easy to get to hear of it. I met people afterwards who had served in Siberia and knew it well, who yet heard for the first time of the special division from me. In the legal code there are 6 lines about it. Quote, "There shall be instituted in such and such a prison of special division for the worst criminals until the opening of works involving harder labor in Siberia." Unquote. Even the convicts of this division did not know whether it was a permanent or a temporary institution. No time limit was mentioned. All that was said was, until the opening of works involving harder labor, so it was meant for convicts who were in for life. It is no wonder that Sushilov and the rest of his party knew nothing about it, even including Mikhailov, who could only form an idea of the special division from the gravity of his crime, for which he had already received 3,000 or 4,000 blows. He might well conclude they were not sending him to anything very nice. Sushilov was on his way to a settlement. Could anything be better? "Wouldn't you like to exchange?" Sushilov, a simple-hearted soul, a little tipsy and overwhelmed with gratitude to Mikhailov for being kind to him, does not venture to refuse. Besides, he has heard already from the others that exchanges are possible, that other people have exchanged, so that there is nothing exceptional or unheard of about it. They come to an agreement. The shameless Mikhailov, taking advantage of Sushilov's extraordinary simplicity, buys his name for a red shirt and a silver rouble, which he gives him on the spot before witnesses. Next day, Sushilov is no longer drunk, but he is given drink again. Besides, it is a mean thing to go back on a bargain. The rouble he has taken has gone on drink, and the red shirt quickly follows it. If he won't keep his bargain, he must give back the money. And where is Sushilov to get a whole silver rouble? And if he does not repay it, the gang will make him. That's a point they are strict about. Besides, if he has made a promise, he must keep it. The gang will insist on that too, or else they will devour him. They will beat him, perhaps, or simply kill him. In any case, they will threaten to. Indeed, if the gang were once to be indulgent in such a matter, the practice of changing names would be at an end. If it were possible to go back on a promise and break a bargain after taking money, who would ever keep it afterwards? This, in fact, is a question that concerns the gang, concerns all, and therefore the gang is very stern about it. At last Sushilov sees that there is no begging off it and makes up his mind to agree without protest. It is announced to the whole gang, and other people are bribed with drink and money if necessary. It is just the same to them, of course, whether Mikhailov or Sushilov goes to the devil, but vodka has been drunk, they have been treated, so they hold their tongues. At the next étape, the roll is called. When Mikhailov's name is called, Sushilov answers, "Here." When Sushilov's is called, Mikhailov shouts, "Here," and they go on their way. Nothing more is said about it. At Tobolsk, the convicts are sorted. Mikhailov is sent to a settlement, and Sushilov is conducted with extra guards to the special division. Protest later is impossible. And after all, how could he prove it? How many years would an inquiry into such a case take? Might he not come in for something else? Where are his witnesses? If he had them, they would deny it. So the upshot of it is that for a red shirt and a rouble, Sushilov is sent to the special division. The convicts laughed at Sushilov not because he had exchanged, though they feel contempt for all who exchange a lighter sentence for a heavier one, as they do for all fools who have been duped, but because he had done it for a red shirt and a rouble, too trivial a price. Convicts usually receive large sums, relatively speaking, for exchanging. They sometimes charge dozens of roubles. But Sushilov was so submissive, such a non-entity, so paltry in the eyes of all, that he was not even worth laughing at. I got on very well with Sushilov for several years. By degrees he became extremely devoted to me. I could not help noticing it, so that I became quite attached to him, too. But one day he did not do something I had asked him, though I had just given him some money, and I can never forgive myself for it. I had the cruelty to say to him, "Well, Sushilov, you take the money, but you don't do your work. He said nothing, ran to do the job, but became suddenly depressed. 2 days passed. I thought to myself, surely it can't be on account of what I said. I knew that one of the convicts called Anton Vasiliev was worrying him very persistently about a trifling debt. Probably he has no money and is afraid to ask me. On the 3rd day I said to him, Sushilov, I think you wanted to ask me for the money to pay Anton Vasiliev. Take it. I was sitting on the bed at the time. Sushilov was standing before me. He seemed greatly impressed at my offering him the money, at my thinking of his difficult position of my own accord, especially as he had, in his own opinion, been paid too much by me of late, so that he had not dared to hope that I would give him more. He looked at the money, then at me, suddenly turned away and went out. All this surprised me very much. I followed him and found him behind the prison. He was standing facing the fence with his head bent down and his elbow leaning on the fence. Sushilov, what is it? I asked him. He did not look at me, and I noticed to my great amazement that he was on the point of tears. Alexander Petrovitch, you think, he began in a breaking voice, trying to look away, that I do for you, for money, but Then he turned to the fence again, even striking his forehead against it, and broke into sobs. It was the first time I had seen a man crying in prison. With great effort I comforted him, and though after that he began to serve me and look after me more zealously than ever, if possible, yet from certain hardly perceptible signs I perceived that his heart could never forgive me that reproach. And yet other people laughed at him, nagged at him on every occasion, and sometimes abused him violently. And he was on amiable and even friendly terms with them, and never took offense. Yes, indeed, it is very hard to understand a man even after long years. That is why I could not see the prisoners at first as they really were, and as they seemed to me later. That is why I said that, though I looked at everything with eager and concentrated attention, I could not discern a great deal that was just before my eyes. It was natural that I was struck at first by the most remarkable and prominent facts, but even these I probably saw incorrectly, and all that was left by them was an oppressive, hopelessly melancholy sensation, which was greatly confirmed by my meeting with A, convict who had reached the prison not long before me, and who made a particularly painful impression upon me during the first days I was in prison. I knew, however, before I reached the prison that I should meet A there. He poisoned that first terrible time for me and increased my mental sufferings. I cannot avoid speaking about him. He was the most revolting example of the depths to which a man can sink and degenerate, and the extent to which he can destroy all moral feeling in himself without difficulty or repentance. A was that young man of good family of whom I have mentioned already that he reported to the major everything that took place in the prison, and was friendly with his orderly Fedka. Here is a brief account of his story. After quarreling with his Moscow relations, who were horrified by his vicious conduct, he arrived in Petersburg without finishing his studies, and to get money he gave information to the police in a very base way. That is, sold the lives of a dozen men for the immediate gratification of his insatiable lust for the coarsest and most depraved pleasures. Lured by the temptations of Petersburg and its taverns, he became so addicted to his vices that, though he was by no means a fool, he ventured on a mad and senseless enterprise. He was soon detected. In his information to the police, he had implicated innocent people and deceived others, and it was for this that he was sent for 10 years to Siberia to our prison. He was still quite young. Life was only beginning for him. One would have thought such a terrible change in his fate must have made a great impression on his nature, would have called forth all his powers of resistance, and have caused a complete transformation in him. But he accepted his new life without the slightest perturbation, without the slightest aversion indeed. He was not morally revolted by it, nor frightened by anything except the necessity of working, and the loss of the taverns and other attractions of Petersburg. It actually seemed to him that his position as a convict set him free to commit even more scoundrelly and revolting actions. "If one is a convict, one may as well be one. If one is a convict, one may do nasty things, and it's no shame to." That was literally his opinion. I think of this disgusting creature as a phenomenon. I spent several years among murderers, profligates, and thoroughgoing scoundrels, but I can positively say that I never in my life met such an utter moral downfall, such complete depravity, and such insolent baseness as in A. There was amongst us a parricide of good family. I have mentioned him already, but I became convinced from many traits and incidents that even he was incomparably nobler and more humane than A. All the while I was in prison, A seemed to me a lump of flesh with teeth and a stomach and an insatiable thirst for the most sensual and brutish pleasures. And to satisfy the most trifling and capricious of his desires, he was capable of the most cold-blooded murder, in fact of anything, if only the crime could be concealed. I am not exaggerating. I got to know A well. He was an example of what a man can come to when the physical side is unrestrained by any inner standard, any principle. And how revolting it was to me to look on his everlasting mocking smile. He was a monster, a moral Quasimodo. Add to that he was cunning and clever, good-looking, even rather well-educated, and had abilities. Yes, such a man is a worse plague in society than fire, flood, and famine. I have said already that there was such general depravity in prison that spying and treachery flourished, and the convicts were not angry at it. On the contrary, they were all very friendly with A, and behaved far more amiably to him than to us. The favor in which he stood with our drunken major gave him importance and weight among them. Meanwhile, he made the major believe that he could paint portraits. He had made the convicts believe that he had been a lieutenant in the guards. And the major insisted on A's being sent to work in his house, to paint the major's portrait, of course. Here he made friends with the major's orderly, Fedka, who had an extraordinary influence over his master, and consequently over everything and everybody in the prison. A played the spy amongst us to meet the major's requirements, and when the latter hit A in the face in his fits of drunkenness, he used to abuse him as being a spy and a traitor. It happened sometimes, pretty often in fact, that the major would sit down and command A to go on with his portrait immediately after beating him. Our major seemed really to believe that A was a remarkable artist, almost on a level with Brulov, of whom even he had heard. At the same time, he felt himself quite entitled to slap him in the face, feeling probably that, though he was a great artist, he was now a convict, and had he been 10 times Brulov, the major was still his superior, and therefore could do what he liked with him. Among other things, he made A take off his boots for him and empty his slops, and yet for a long time he could not get over the idea that A was a great artist. The portrait lingered on endlessly, almost for a year. At last the major realized that he was being duped, and becoming convinced that the portrait never would be finished, but on the contrary became less and less like him every day, he flew into a rage, gave the artist a thrashing and sent him to hard labor in the prison as a punishment. A evidently regretted this and felt bitterly the loss of his idle days, his titbits from the Major's table, the company of his friend Fedka, and all the enjoyments that Fedka and he contrived for themselves in the Major's kitchen. At any rate, after getting rid of A, the Major gave up persecuting M, a convict whom A was always slandering to the Major. At the time of A's arrival, M was the only political in the prison. He was very miserable, had nothing in common with the other convicts, looked upon them with horror and loathing, failed to observe what might have reconciled him to them, and did not get on with them. They repaid him with the same hatred. The position of people like M in prison is awful as a rule. M knew nothing of the crime that had brought A to prison. On the contrary, seeing the sort of man he had to do with, A at once assured him that he was being punished for the very opposite of treachery, almost the same thing in fact as a charge for which M was suffering. The latter was greatly delighted at having a comrade, a friend. He waited upon him, comforted him in the first days of prison, imagining that he must be in great distress, gave him his last penny, fed him, and shared the most necessary things with him. But A conceived a hatred for him at once, just because he was a fine man, just because he looked with horror on anything mean, because he was utterly unlike himself. And all that M told A about the Major and the prison, A hastened at the first opportunity to report to the Major. The Major took an intense dislike to M in consequence, and persecuted him. Had it not been for the governor of the prison, it would have ended in a tragedy. A was not in the least disconcerted when M found out later on how base he had been. On the contrary, he liked meeting him and looked at him ironically. It evidently gave him gratification. M himself pointed this out to me several times. This abject creature afterwards ran away from the prison with another convict and a guard, but that escape I will describe later. At first he made up to me, thinking I had heard nothing of his story. I repeat, he poisoned my first days in prison and made them even more miserable. I was terrified at the awful baseness and degradation into which I had been cast, and in the midst of which I found myself. I imagined that everything here was as base and as degraded. But I was mistaken. I judged of all by A. I spent those 3 days wandering miserably about the prison and lying on the bed. I gave the stuff that was served out to me to a trustworthy convict recommended to me by Akim Akimych, and asked him to make it into shirts, for payment, of course, a few halfpence a shirt. I provided myself, at Akim Akimich's urgent advice, with a folding mattress made of felt encased in linen, but as thin as a pancake, and also got a pillow stuffed with wool, terribly hard till one was used to it. Akim Akimych was quite in a bustle arranging all these things for me, and helped to get them himself. With his own hands he made me a quilt out of rags of old cloth cut out of discarded jackets and trousers, which I bought from other convicts. The prison clothes become the property of the prisoner when they are worn out. They are at once sold on the spot in the prison, and however ancient a garment might be, there was always a hope of getting something for it. I was much surprised at first by all this. It was practically my first contact with men of the peasant class. I had suddenly become a man of the same humble class, a convict like the rest. Their habits, ideas, opinions, customs, became, as it were, also mine, externally, legally anyway, though I did not share them really. I was surprised and confused, as though I had heard nothing of all this and had not suspected its existence. Yet I had heard of it and knew of it. But the reality makes quite a different impression from what one hears and knows. I could, for instance, never have suspected that such things, such old rags, could be looked upon as objects of value. Yet it was of these rags that I made myself a quilt. It was hard to imagine such cloth as was served out for the convict's clothing. It looked like thick cloth such as is used in the army, but after very little wearing it became like a sieve and tore shockingly. Cloth garments were, however, only expected to last a year. Yet it was hard to make them do service for so long. The convict has to work, to carry heavy weights. His clothes quickly wear out and go into holes. The sheepskin coats are supposed to last 3 years, and they were used for that time as coats by day and both underblanket and covering at night. But a sheepskin coat is strong, though it was not unusual to see a convict at the end of the 3rd year in a sheepskin patched with plain hempen cloth. Yet even very shabby ones were sold for as much as 40 kopecks at the end of the 3 years. Some in better preservation even fetched as much as 60 or 70, and that was a large sum in prison. Money, as I have mentioned already, was of vast and overwhelming importance in prison. One may say for a positive fact that the sufferings of a convict who had money, however little, were not a tenth of what were endured by one who had none, though the latter too had everything provided by government, and so, as the prison authorities argue, could have no need of money. I repeat again, if the prisoners had been deprived of all possibility of having money of their own, they would either have gone out of their minds or have died off like flies, in spite of being provided with everything, or would have resorted to incredible violence, some from misery, others in order to be put to death and end it all as soon as possible, or anyway to change their luck, the technical expression. If after earning his money with cruel effort, or making use of extraordinary cunning, often in conjunction with theft and cheating, the convict wastes what he has earned so carelessly, with such childish senselessness, it does not prove that he does not appreciate it, though it might seem so at the first glance. The convict is morbidly, insanely greedy of money, and if he throws it away like so much rubbish, he throws it away on what he considers of even more value. What is more precious than money for the convict? Freedom, or some sort of dream of freedom. The prisoner is a great dreamer. I shall have something to say of this later, but while we are on the subject, would it be believed that I have known convicts sentenced for 20 years, who, speaking to me, have quite calmly used such phrases as, "You wait a bit. When, please God, my term is up, then I'll—" The word convict means nothing else but a man with no will of his own, and in spending money he is showing a will of his own. In spite of brands, fetters, and the hateful prison fence which shuts him off from God's world and cages him in like a wild beast, he is able to obtain vodka, an article prohibited under terrible penalties, to get at women, even sometimes, though not always, to bribe the veterans and even the sergeants, who will wink at his breaches of law and discipline. He can play the swaggering bully over them into the bargain, and the convict is awfully fond of bullying, that is, pretending to his companions and even persuading himself, if only for a time, that he has infinitely more power and freedom than is supposed. He can in fact carouse and make an uproar, crush and insult others, and prove to them that he can do all this, that it is all in his own hands, that is, he can persuade himself of what is utterly out of the question for the poor fellow. That, by the way, is perhaps why one detects in all convicts, even when sober, a propensity to swagger, to boastfulness, to a comic and very naive, though fantastic, glorification of their personality. Moreover, all this disorderliness has its special risk, so it all has a semblance of life, and at least a far-off semblance of freedom. And what will one not give for freedom? What millionaire would not give all his millions for one breath of air if his neck were in the noose? The prison authorities are sometimes surprised that after leading a quiet, exemplary life for some years, and even being made a foreman for his model behavior, a convict with no apparent reason suddenly breaks out, as though he were possessed by a devil, plays pranks, drinks, makes an uproar, and sometimes positively ventures on serious crimes, such as open disrespect to a superior officer, or even commits murder or rape. They look at him and marvel. And all the while, possibly the cause of this sudden outbreak, and the man from whom one would least have expected it, is simply the poignant, hysterical craving for self-expression, the unconscious yearning for himself, the desire to assert himself, to assert his crushed personality, a desire which suddenly takes possession of him and reaches the pitch of fury, of spite, of mental aberration, of fits and nervous convulsions. So perhaps a man buried alive and awakening in his coffin might beat upon its lid and struggle to fling it off, though of course reason might convince him that all his efforts would be useless. But the trouble is that it is not a question of reason. It is a question of nerves. We must take into consideration also that almost every expression of personality on the part of a convict is looked upon as a crime, and so it makes no difference whether it is a small offense or a great one. If he is to drink, he may as well do it thoroughly. If he is to venture on anything, he may as well venture on everything, even on a murder. And the only effort is to begin. As he goes on, the man gets intoxicated, and there is no holding him back. And so it would be better in every way not to drive him to that point. It would make things easier for everyone. Yes, but how is it to be done? Breaking in. While I am far from certain about this, when our narrator says that Sushilov belonged to the same division as Sirotkin, due to his submissiveness and spiritlessness, he may have more than one meaning in mind. On the one hand, his submissiveness led him to become a convict of the dreaded Special Division, to which Sirotkin belongs. But there may be a veiled comment here about sexual orientation as well, which could potentially lie behind the jeers that Sushilov receives from other convicts. Quasimodo is the name of the famous Hunchback of Notre Dame from Hugo's novel. The point of Goryanchikov's application of this moniker is that A is morally deformed. Karl Brulov was one of the most famous Russian painters of the early 19th century, who was well known for his portraits. The Major was apparently disappointed to discover that A's acumen with the brush fell well short of Brulov's. A is among the more significant figures in the book, simply for the impact he had upon the author. Similarly, the musings in the last few paragraphs of this chapter are very important thematically. I'll have occasion to address both later. End of comments.